Chapter 2, Episode 1, September 2016. What fresh hell can this be? Dorothy Parker. It was a hot, sticky Friday in Houston. I'd not felt well for a few days, run down, scratchy throat, and a slight headache. I took a few ibuprofen and powered through, ready to see the 7 clients I had scheduled for the day. However, halfway through I realized I'd run out of juice. I called and canceled my last few sessions of the day. My throat was hurting, my head was pounding, and I felt feverish. Being early afternoon on a Friday, it was impossible to see my internist immediately, so I decided to just go home and take the weekend to relax and heal. As I drove home, I felt worse with each minute that passed. I wasn't sure if it was the flu, maybe strep throat, maybe just a bad sinus infection, but I decided to stop by an urgent care center near my house. I was seen almost immediately, and after a few minutes with the doctor, he felt that I might have the beginning of bronchitis. I told him that I would see my internist as soon as possible the following week. However, he felt it would be good to get on top of it and wrote me 2 prescriptions, one for an antibiotic, the generic version of the antibiotic Levaquin called levofloxacin, and an oral steroid. Since I'd previously not done well on steroids, I chose not to fill that script. This proved serendipitous, and I thanked God when I learned later that taking a steroid with this particular type of antibiotic can cause big issues for certain people. I've also since learned that taking a benzodiazepine while on this class of antibiotics can strip the GABA A receptor, leading to acute benzo withdrawal. I also learned, unfortunately much too late, that combining NSAIDs, such as Motrin or Advil, with this particular antibiotic was also highly problematic for many. I was never asked at the urgent care center if I was on any of these medications. While I wasn't on a benzo, I had most certainly been taking loads of the NSAIDs earlier in the day for my headache and throughout the short time taking the antibiotic. I will never know if that led to the adverse reactions coming my way. I filled the antibiotic prescription, went home, and took the first pill. It was 6 p.m. I fell asleep early and woke up in the middle of the night dizzy and sweating, and felt like I was getting worse. I was thankful for the antibiotic as I assumed my new symptoms of dizziness, blurred vision, and vacillating from burning to freezing resulted from my illness. I woke up the next morning on the cold tile of the bathroom, having no memory of how I'd gotten there. I ate breakfast and took my 2nd dose. I remember starting to feel like I was going to have a panic attack, which I attributed to being so sick and was now worried about my busy week ahead. I felt too ill to begin calling my Monday patients to cancel and prayed that I'd be feeling better and wouldn't have to do so by Sunday. I took my 3rd and what turned out to be my final dose that evening. That Saturday night, I mostly tossed and turned as I came in and out of what I describe as toxic sleep. The next morning, I woke up and my ears began to scream. It sounds dramatic because it was. My ears literally began to scream a high-pitched squeal that would not stop. I began to pace my home, sweating and freezing, feeling like my eyesight had suddenly and dramatically changed as everything was blurry. I couldn't sit still, and I felt as if someone had plugged me into a socket. As I paced my home, I began to feel a sense of fear that I had never experienced before. I looked in the mirror and wondered if I was real. There were moments I did not recognize myself from my home. I looked through the window at the backyard and saw the pool. Suddenly, the thought that I would drown myself in the pool was upon me. I was not suicidal and never had been. I did not feel depressed. In fact, I did not feel real enough to have a mood state. It was an intrusive thought that I would simply drown myself in the swimming pool. I immediately double-locked the door. Some part of me was still intact, the objective healthy me trying to protect myself from going into the backyard. I called a dear friend who's a psychiatrist and oversees an inpatient hospital unit and said, "I think you need to hospitalize me. Something's very wrong." My friend stayed on the phone with me for nearly 2 hours, and I began to slightly come back into myself. We agreed that since the only thing that had changed was taking a new medication, I should stop the antibiotic until I could see my internist on Monday. This gem of a human and a few other friends were my lifelongs along the way. I went to splash cold water on my face and was met with the intrusive thought, "You could just drown yourself in the bathtub or even this sink." Suddenly, and for the next 2 weeks, any sight of water led me to a series of strange, intrusive thoughts. Stranger, though, is that I have zero fear of the water. I was a swimmer, and I feel my best in the water. Never in my 46 years had I ever experienced an intrusive thought or ever been suicidal. Even though my identity as a psychotherapist was the furthest thing from my mind in these moments, I was learning something about fear, annihilation anxiety, and a distrust of one's mind that would have a profound impact on the way I sat with and understood my clients in the future. I was aware there was still some sliver of me observing this rapid mental and physical deterioration of myself. Some part of me that was able to say, this isn't you. Something has happened to you. You just need to stay safe. That evening, I laid myself down to sleep, and my legs and arms burned as though someone was holding one of those 3-foot-long gray 4th of July sparklers against them. I began to have shooting pains in my feet and calves. My screaming ears had dulled to a constant whooshing sound, and I was unable to see well enough to watch TV or read. I tried to play some of my favorite music. I found Chris Body on my phone only to realize I had suddenly developed spidey ears, also known as hyperacusis, and I could not tolerate music, even at its lowest volume. Then the pacing resumed, back and forth between the kitchen and the bedroom. I had no idea how to quell the intense internal tremor or to calm my mind, and that night, having never experienced insomnia before, became the longest night's journey into day I could ever imagine. On Monday morning, having been out of bed pacing since 4 a.m., I was so grateful for the break of dawn. Being unable to rest while the world slept only intensified my fear and distress. I was unable to look in the mirror as I only saw a distortion, and what was reflected back to me was unrecognizable. I would pinch myself to keep myself in the moment and not drift into an altered state of consciousness. I could not wait to hear back from my internist and somehow got in my car and drove the 11 miles to her office. I sat in the parking lot from 7 a.m. until they opened at 8. I walked in feeling like I possibly needed to and feared that I would be sent immediately to the emergency room, or worse, a locked psych ward. It was all surreal. I do not remember how I got past the front desk into a room waiting to see my doctor. The internist I'd had for 5 years had recently retired, and I'd only met her replacement on one brief occasion for a yearly physical. As I waited and paced the office, I thought, pull it together, Jen, pull it together. She entered the room, and I tried my best to sound somewhat coherent as I rattled off my list of symptoms. Although I remember her to be kind, I'm quite certain she distrusted me, believing instead that I was a closet alcoholic, drug seeker, or just very mentally unstable and disturbed. I described the tinnitus, the shooting pains, the blurry vision, the elephant on my chest, the pressure in my head, feelings of not being real, an inability to concentrate, and insomnia as she typed them all into her computer. Eventually she turned and looked at me. I realized I was pacing and forced myself to sit down. We were both quiet for what seemed an eternity. She took my pulse and said she was happy I had discontinued the antibiotic. She asked several questions. Had I been drinking on it, doing drugs, taking other antibiotics, other meds? All were a big no. She said the medication might still be in my system, but felt sure that what I was experiencing was not related to the antibiotic now. Without looking at me, she said, "Have you ever been diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder? That would explain most of this." I began to cry. Of course, looking back, that probably only strengthened the narrative I feared she was creating in her mind, one of a middle-aged hysteric. I fought my way back to a moment of sanity and said, "Please, I need you to hear me. I have no psychiatric history. Yes, I've had my share of stressors, and probably could have managed those stressors better in my life. I'm on no medication, nor have I ever taken any other medication other than my thyroid med for hypothyroidism that I have had since I was 20. But I just had blood work a month ago, and that's been stable for many years. I work a lot. I have a vibrant private practice. I love what I do. I'm very active. And last week I had a sore throat, took this prescribed medication, and today I no longer recognize myself." Perhaps this moment of clarity slowed her down a bit. She actually looked at me for a long time and said, "It is clear you're in a lot of distress. Let's get you in to see some specialists and get some blood work right away." Over the next 4 days, as I waited to see the neurologist, my blood work came back. I'll never forget the nurse calling me and saying, "Good news, your blood work's fine," Except funny thing, you're now hyperthyroid. So you're going to have to get in to see your endocrinologist and get that taken care of right away. I asked to speak to the doctor. Later that day, when the doctor called back, I said, don't you think it's strange that a month ago my thyroid labs were stable, have been for many, many years, and now suddenly and for the first time in my life, I'm hyperthyroid? She said, Jennifer, most of your symptoms could be explained by hyperthyroidism. We've found the answer, maybe. I hung up and cried again. I would have loved for it to have been that simple. But we know our bodies. No matter how crazy you are made to feel, do not ever forget that you are the one wearing that bag of skin, and you know it better than anyone. I saw 7 specialists over the next 24 days. Cardiologists, neurologists, endocrinologists, gastroenterologists, ear, nose, and throat doctors, an OBGYN, and my internist. I won't bore you with all the details, but what I heard over and over again was some version of this. Jennifer, I don't really know what's happening, but I know it cannot be the antibiotic. That is long out of your system. I recall saying many times, I'm aware it's out of my system, but is it possible that while it was in my system, it caused some sort of damage? A few paused and told me that they'd heard about spontaneous tendon ruptures being caused by this particular medication, but nothing like I was describing. Each and every one of them recommended I see a psychiatrist and look at depression and anxiety disorders. I remember thinking to myself, so this med could cause your Achilles heel to spontaneously rupture, but it's too much of a leap to think that it could potentially cause any other damage? In the 3 months that followed that fateful September day, I would see 7 specialists and have a total of 25 doctor's appointments. One of my favorite appointments came 2 months later when the endocrinologist who'd pulled me off all my thyroid medicine, the first time in 26 years, came in and said, well, the good news is you no longer have a thyroid situation. Your blood work's been normal for 6 weeks. No more meds for you, at least for now. We'll check you again in 6 months. Keep in mind that as he said this, I was still not sleeping. I'd lost 17 pounds. I'd returned to work but at a reduced capacity and would return home at night only to pace and try to find ways to manage the screaming in my ears, the tremor in my chest, and the pain in my legs. I looked at the endocrinologist and said, okay, but wait, don't you at least find this interesting? I've had hypothyroidism since I was 20 years old. I've been on medications for the last 26 years. I took an antibiotic. I feel like a bomb went off inside me, and suddenly I'm cured? As he patted my shoulder and opened the door to walk out, he said, I didn't say cured. We'll see you in 6 months, but for now, go and celebrate. That was the moment. The moment where I felt something in me crack. I'd gone through life and had never really felt a full frontal impact of what it is to be disavowed, disbelieved, devalued, invisible, or written off as crazy or unstable. Unfortunately, this blessing meant that I had no skill set to help me manage or make sense of how to maneuver a world in which I was now being overtly written off, unseen, unheard, and pathologized. While I didn't know it then, this too would forever change me in my clinical practice and in my life. The sheer rage, disorientation, and hopelessness caused by that sort of gaslighting is something I will take to my grave. And the pain opened me up to an awareness that has forever changed how I think about all sorts of marginalized or disempowered individuals and groups. I had always been a social worker in thought, heart, and career choice. But this trauma drilled further in me a need to always search for one's humanity, to really listen, and to trust that maybe not seeing or understanding something did not mean it was not true or didn't exist. This secondary trauma of being written off, while nearly breaking me emotionally, is what ultimately led me to discover and become a lover of the philosophy of Stoicism, deepen my faith, and develop mental strategies to increase resilience, as well as leading to the realization that it was going to be up to me to fight for my health and recovery. This is not to say that I didn't have loving, caring friends, colleagues, and family that were pulling for me. However, I was out there in medical no man's land. And once there, you have to go through that part of the journey alone. As I slumped out of the endocrinologist's office to celebrate, feeling the worst possible pain I could imagine, I began to laugh. I climbed into my car and laughed, a crazy, maniacal carnival laugh. Imagine Tom Hanks' character Walter Fielding in the movie The Money Pit. He's standing over a hole in the floor after the bathtub that he was filling with a bucket falls through to the living room below, and he stands there belting out a crazy carnival laugh while his life and home fall to pieces around him. That was me and my Pathfinder laughing and crying like a sad, dysregulated party clown. However, in that laugh, I remembered something, a bit of me. I had been a funny person. I had been a good aunt and a loving daughter, a vested therapist, a kind sibling, and a caring friend. I was going to come out of this. This is when a few things began to turn around for me. Not physically, that would be many, many months later, but psychologically, I felt me reach out for me, if that makes sense, and wrap my arms around myself. I remember sitting in my car thinking, I'm going to be okay. I recalled one of my lovely clients telling me about the Stockdale paradox. James Stockdale had been a prisoner of war, and when asked how he survived mentally and physically, he said he didn't hold out false hope, like, I'll be home by Christmas. He would say something to himself like, I'm going to be okay one day. I don't know when that is, but today is obviously not that day, and today I have to do what I need to do to survive this hell. As I sat in my car shaking, scared, and feeling 1,000 miles away from who I had been just a few months before, I thought, you will be okay, Jen, but today is not that day. For now you need to do what needs to be done. This system of reasonable hope and radical acceptance has become very handy to me over the last few years. Although I knew I hadn't developed a crippling form of anxiety overnight, and most of the emotional and mental symptoms had already begun to dissipate, I knew the symptoms that remained were causing a great deal of distress. I needed to find someone willing to try to help me. I had exhausted nearly all other specialties, so I decided to find a good psychiatrist to see if they could help me find any answers. Having worked with and befriended many good psychiatrists in the Houston area over the years in my profession, I chose one I deeply respected, but that did not run in my close circle of friends. This doctor had also never known this antibiotic to cause these symptoms, but he did believe that I'd been injured by it. We started to treat the symptoms with nerve medication, gabapentin, and a common benzodiazepine, alprazolam, the generic for Xanax, in an attempt to slow down what appeared to be symptoms of a wildly sensitized nervous system, neuropathy, tinnitus, fuzzy vision, nausea, difficulty sleeping, and shooting random nerve pain throughout my body. Again, all of this was well-meaning, but I would learn years later it was not a good fit for me. I was still nowhere near my baseline, but I was starting to notice better hours and better days. My clients and my nieces and nephews got all I had to give. I would go home and pace, put in my earplugs to manage my hyperacusis, my spidey ears. I would stare in terror at my bedroom that had become a house of horrors, still only getting 3 to 4 hours of sleep a night before being jolted awake by a storm of adrenaline and cortisol, and experiencing racing thoughts and fear that I would never again be okay. As time went on, I made a game out of the random piercing pains in my feet and legs, like a bad game of whack-a-mole. Where would the next one pop up? After having my vision checked twice, I began to accept the feeling of wearing fogged-up goggles. This is one symptom that never left, still has not left, as being a part of my new life. Then, in early January of 2017, 4 months after the antibiotic injury, 2 things happened that were crucial to my healing. First, I went to see a new ear, nose, and throat doctor regarding the overwhelming tinnitus and the hyperacusis. He listened to me and to my story and said, "Oh my God, I think I know what happened. My wife went through this. I think you've had a neurotoxic reaction to that antibiotic." He explained that although my reaction was rare, there was an existing black box warning on all of the fluoroquinolone antibiotics since 2008, warning against spontaneous tendon ruptures. He explained it had been amended in 2013, advising that this class of medication could cause potentially irreversible neuropathy, nerve damage. In 2015, a Federal Advisory Council meeting Excuse me, guys, my dog hit the thing. In 2013, advising that this class of medication could cause potentially irreversible neuropathy, nerve damage. In 2015, a Federal Advisory Council meeting deemed the risks outweighed the benefits of using fluoroquinolones, things like Levaquin or Cipro, for sinusitis, urinary tract infections, and bronchitis. Remember, I was placed on for possible bronchitis. It was then amended again. So the FDA report was amended again in 2016, 5 months before I was injured, adding the warning for potentially serious, disabling, and possibly permanent side effects that could involve tendons, muscles, joints, nerves, and the central nervous system. I remember feeling both vindicated and sick to my stomach simultaneously. I told him that I'd been to see 7 specialists and over 24 doctor's visits in the last few years and had been told by each that the antibiotic could not be responsible for the myriad of symptoms. I remember he looked down and said, "I honestly don't know. It's hard to keep up with all the changes of every medication, but your symptoms are clearly that of an injury to the nervous system. So why they didn't slow down and dig deeper, I just don't know, Jen." The following words were a game changer for me. He turned to me and said, "Jennifer, I'm so sorry this has happened to you. You should never have been given this medication. It's a very heavy antibiotic. It's a hard hitter. It is not meant for a sore throat. Maybe if you'd tried several other antibiotics with no relief or had severe pneumonia in the hospital, but you had probably a bad cold. This medication should be used as a last resort. At the very least, you should have been informed of the risks." I could literally feel the effects of being seen, heard, and understood. I could feel my resolve strengthen in his words and gaze. Later that same week, I decided I would try to do something normal other than going to work and home again. I went and got my hair cut and colored. Having normally been in every 4 to 6 weeks, my regular hairdresser said, "Girl, where have you been?" I was used to not sharing the truth about how I was currently doing, as I feared being disbelieved or seen as a hypochondriac. But for some reason, I decided to be open and honest. I said, "Well, I've actually been really sick. It's kind of a long story, but basically I took this antibiotic, a generic form of Levaquin, and it kind of blew up my life." I'm sure my voice broke as I spoke. I think, sensing my distress, Stephanie touched my shoulder and said, "Wait, don't say anything else. Let me tell you something first." She explained that about a year earlier she'd been going out of town to go surfing, had gotten sick, and was started on the generic version of Levaquin. She described not feeling great on it and having had a bad headache. On the 4th day of her 7-day prescription, she took ibuprofen to help with her headache. She said, "Jennifer, I jolted out of bed a couple of hours later. My heart was racing. I was having a panic attack." She went on to describe a litany of my own symptoms, including issues with blurry vision, floaters, strange pains, rapid onset panic attacks with no prior history, and a sense of feeling detached and dissociative. She, like me, had tried to figure out what could have caused these things to happen. I sat there with my mouth open as she described a parallel process to the hell I'd been in for months. I could have jumped up and hugged her. I told her how many doctors and health professionals had told me that my issues were an underlying anxiety condition and were not associated with the antibiotic, as they felt it was long out of my system. Between this ENT doctor and Stephanie's validation, I felt another shift in my psychological attitude towards myself and my struggle. I knew I wasn't crazy, but it felt so important to have found someone that could mirror and validate that for me. I had found a trauma twin in Stephanie, and no longer felt alone made an enormous difference. Soon, I found a few online support groups and discovered that my condition was referred to as being floxed, as in an injury caused by the group of fluoroquinolone antibiotics. I was horrified to find literally thousands of people suffering far more debilitating reactions than myself. I eventually had to literally step away and stop reading the terrifying stories of people, young and old, talking about being bedbound, needing multiple surgeries to correct torn tendons, and many like me who were suffering from neurological issues for years with no remission. I knew I couldn't allow myself to get swallowed up in the horror of it all, and I had to pray that I would be one of the lucky ones and focus on positive thoughts and actions. With my alprazolam, Xanax, and my gabapentin on board, I just treated my symptoms and worked hard to move forward in my life as best I could. At the time, my doctor and I didn't know that we were quite possibly creating an issue for me down the road with this mix of medications. This was somewhat uncharted territory, and we were both just trying to take it one day at a time. His belief that there'd been an adverse reaction and his desire to stay with me through it was invaluable. We didn't know if my nervous system was injured or damaged, so we just did the best we could, and I prayed that it would eventually resolve. In time, it did. I was significantly better 5 to 6 months later, and I really turned a corner about month 8 or 9. I began to take the medication less and less, knowing nothing about withdrawal or how to come off these medications. Did I mention to you that I've been in the field of psychology and psychiatry for 24 years? Yep. And I did not know that most people need to taper off these meds slowly to avoid a rough withdrawal. It has taken a lot of work on self-compassion to forgive myself for not knowing. By the first anniversary date, I was rarely taking these meds now only as needed, and I fought taking them at all. By month 15, I was off them altogether. Withdrawal from benzos is not an easy, smooth process for many, and many do not do well with the standard procedure of cutting it down by 25% every few weeks. But amazingly, I did. I simply walked off them. This stroke of luck would prove to be disastrous, as it is for many, as I didn't think twice about taking a benzodiazepine again when it was prescribed to me during my second episode a few years later. While significantly better, I had not returned to my baseline. I was very functional, worked full-time, and was able to be an aunt, sister, and friend while loving and playing and being fully in my life. However, my eyes were always blurry. I still dealt with tinnitus several times a month, and I could just tell that my innards seemed to be a bit more fragile. I felt like I was propped up with toothpicks and bubble gum, rather than the titanium posts that had once held me up. So what did I do? I wanted to distance myself far, far away from that woman who'd become so ill, to move past how close I'd come to losing my mind and nearly losing myself. I did not want to look back. I did not want to research too much. A part of me wanted to return to the floxed sites to let my suffering comrades know that there was light at the end of the tunnel, but I couldn't. When I would log on and see the train wreck the antibiotic had left in the lives of so many, I would feel a need to run far away and pretend that I had not just dodged a very lethal bullet. I had to log off. I wanted only to look forward. I had been one of the lucky ones, and with an element of survivor's guilt, I trudged on. The next 2.5 years had their own share of stressors and joys. My life has always gone that way. Love big, hurt big, big joys, big losses. With an immediate family of 20 members and growing larger by the year, there was always so much to keep us entertained or crisis managed. Health-wise, I was doing fine. I worked hard to stay well and was terrified of ever taking an antibiotic again. I knew I would never return to a fluoroquinolone, but I'd also developed a strong fear of most medications at this point. I was back to traveling to New York City several times a year to quench my thirst for all things musical theater. I was going out with friends, hosting parties, had moved into a beautiful new apartment in my favorite part of Houston, and my private practice was thriving. I was enjoying weekend slumber parties with my various nieces and nephews, attending their sporting events and going on family vacations. I got to watch one of the pieces of my heart as she gave her high school salutatorian speech and headed off to Notre Dame. I was happy. Unfortunately, as fate would have it, the lights in my life were flickering again. My battles with medications were not over.